Because the movement of the air around the airplane affects the movement of the airplane, you have to pay attention to the wind to fly a specific path over the ground. Not only do you have to track a course when you're on a cross-country flight, but you need to compensate for wind on takeoff, in the traffic pattern, and when you're landing. Practicing ground reference maneuvers helps you become proficient at compensating for the effects of the wind during flight operations. In this lesson, you will learn how to perform ground reference maneuvers as you explore the following topics: key knowledge and skills, performing a rectangular course, performing an S-turn, and performing a turn around a point. Although it can vary based on altitude and location, you can get an idea of the wind direction as you take off and fly to the local practice area to perform ground reference maneuvers. 3 ways to determine the wind direction prior to starting a ground reference maneuver are to note the wind direction at the departure airport by observing wind indicators and by listening to recorded airport information, observe environmental wind indications such as rising smoke, blowing dust, and wave patterns on water or fields. You can also perform a 360-degree turn at a constant airspeed and bank angle and note the drift. Your goal when performing ground reference maneuvers is to maintain a specific track on the ground by correcting for wind drift. 2 methods to compensate for the effects of the wind when you perform a ground reference maneuver are to crab or turn the nose into the wind to prevent wind drift. If you see that the wind is causing you to drift downwind from your intended course, turn the nose into the wind a little. If you're crabbing too much and drifting upwind, fly with less of a crab angle. Change the angle of bank to compensate for changing ground speed. When you're flying downwind, your ground speed is higher, so steepen your bank angle to prevent drifting away from your ground reference. As your ground speed decreases, shallow your bank angle. You will learn how to select features for your ground reference based on the specific maneuver you're practicing. However, 3 actions you can take when selecting a location to perform any ground reference maneuver are: choose a site away from populated areas. It is against regulations to fly at low altitudes over congested areas, and it leaves you with little options in the event of an emergency. Ensure there are no obstructions, such as towers or power lines. Because you are flying at fairly low altitudes, you don't want a minor altitude deviation to turn into a major accident. Select an emergency landing site within gliding distance. The closer you are to the ground, the fewer your options in an emergency, so pick a good landing spot that you can reach from any point in the maneuver. Although each ground reference maneuver track is unique, these maneuvers do have common elements. 4 actions you should always take while performing ground reference maneuvers are to keep the bank angle less than 45 degrees as you vary the amount of bank in turns to compensate for the wind. Maintain altitude by using outside visual references and cross-checking the instruments. Stay alert for traffic. Don't become so absorbed in looking at the ground that you neglect to watch for other aircraft. Maintain awareness of your position in relation to an emergency landing field. When you're practicing a maneuver, it's easy to get distracted and forget that other aircraft might be nearby. This is why, before every maneuver, you need to perform clearing turns for collision avoidance. Clearing turns normally consist of at least 2 90-degree turns in opposite directions. This gives you a good view of the area around your flight path and helps you see and avoid any aircraft that might be in the vicinity. Flying a rectangular course around a field in the practice area helps you prepare to fly a safe and uniform traffic pattern at the airport. You must become proficient at dividing your attention to compensate for the effects of the wind, scan for traffic, and maintain altitude and airspeed. The first step in performing a rectangular course is to select a field to fly around. Choose a rectangle bordered by section lines or roads, with sides 1/2 to 1 mile long. Ensure the wind is blowing parallel to the long sides of the field. After you have selected a field, enter the downwind leg. Maintain 600 to 1,000 feet AGL. Enter at a 45-degree angle to the downwind leg, and fly parallel to the field boundary at a distance of 1/4 to 1/2 mile away. When you get to the end of the field, turn crosswind from downwind. Use the steepest bank angle of the 4 turns to compensate for high ground speed. Decrease the bank angle as your ground speed decreases, and turn more than 90 degrees to crab into the wind. After flying the crosswind leg, turn upwind. Decrease the bank angle as the headwind increases and your ground speed decreases. Because you have a crab angle into the wind on the crosswind leg, turn less than 90 degrees to fly parallel to the field boundary. After flying the length of the field, the next step is to turn crosswind from upwind. Use the shallowest bank angle of the 4 turns to compensate for low ground speed. Increase the bank angle as your ground speed increases, and turn less than 90 degrees to crab into the wind. As you reach the edge of the field, turn downwind. Increase the bank angle as the tailwind and your ground speed increase. Because you have a crab angle into the wind on the crosswind leg, turn more than 90 degrees to fly parallel to the field boundary. You perform an S-turn by flying a series of uniform 180-degree turns in opposite directions, crossing a ground reference line, such as a road. You need to change your bank and crab angle to compensate for wind drift, scan for traffic, and stay at a constant altitude and airspeed. The first step in performing an S-turn is to select a ground reference to fly across. Choose a road or fence line long enough to complete 2 turns. Ensure the wind is blowing perpendicular to the reference line. Once you have picked your ground reference, enter downwind perpendicular to the road. Maintain 600 to 1,000 feet AGL. As you cross the road, immediately roll into a turn. Use a relatively steep bank angle to compensate for high ground speed. Continue the turn and track a half circle over the ground. Use a medium bank angle and crab into the wind when flying directly crosswind. Once you pass the 90-degree point, decrease the bank angle as the headwind increases and your ground speed decreases. As you complete 180 degrees of turn, cross the reference line upwind. Roll out of the turn with the wings level over the road. Roll into a turn in the opposite direction. Use a relatively shallow bank angle to compensate for low ground speed. On the other side of the road, track another half circle. Use a medium bank angle and crab into the wind when flying directly crosswind. Once you pass the 90-degree point, increase the bank angle as the tailwind and your ground speed increase. The next step is to cross the reference line downwind. Roll out of the turn with the wings level over the road. Based on your instructor's direction, roll into a turn in the opposite direction if you're starting another S-turn. The goal of performing a turn around a point is to maintain a constant distance from a reference point on the ground by changing both your bank and crab angle to compensate for wind. At the same time, you need to scan for traffic and stay at a constant altitude and airspeed. The first step in performing a turn around a point is to select a ground reference point. Choose a landmark that is easy to see from all directions. Use an intersection of roads to help you maintain orientation during the turn. After selecting the reference point, enter the turn downwind. Roll into the turn when the reference point is abeam the airplane. Use a relatively steep bank angle to compensate for high ground speed. Next, continue to turn crosswind from downwind. Decrease the bank angle as the tailwind and ground speed decrease. Use a medium bank and crab into the wind when flying directly crosswind. The next step is to turn upwind. Decrease the bank angle as the headwind increases and your ground speed decreases. Use the shallowest bank angle when flying directly upwind. You normally perform more than one 360-degree turn, but to complete the first turn, as you turn crosswind from upwind, increase the bank angle as the headwind decreases and your ground speed increases. Use a medium bank and crab into the wind when flying directly crosswind. As you turn downwind from crosswind, increase the bank angle as the tailwind and ground speed increase. Practicing ground reference maneuvers helps you to become proficient at compensating for the effects of the wind to fly a specific ground track. In this lesson, you learned how to perform 3 ground reference maneuvers by exploring these topics: key knowledge and skills, performing a rectangular course, performing an S-turn, and performing a turn around a point.